When my daughter came home that evening, I could tell something was wrong before she even opened her mouth. Her face was pale, her hands were trembling, and she carried herself as if the weight of the entire world was pressing down on her shoulders. When she finally held up her arm, my heart dropped. The skin was blistered, raw, and angry red, and before I could even process what I was looking at, she whispered that she had burned herself badly at her part-time job. I was horrified, but what left me more speechless than the burn itself was her next confession. Even after she screamed in pain and begged for help, her manager had ordered her to keep working for 3 more hours, forcing her to continue cooking with a second-degree burn. She works at a local restaurant that prides itself on being family-friendly and supposedly valuing its employees. In reality, it's a toxic place where managers act like tyrants and teenagers are treated like disposable labor. She had been working there for only a few months, and I always worried because she was the youngest person on staff. When I pressed her for details, she told me that the kitchen was short-staffed that day, and in the chaos she accidentally touched a boiling pot. The skin sizzled instantly, and tears welled up in her eyes, but instead of letting her run cold water over it or call for medical attention, the manager yelled at her to stop being dramatic and ordered her back to the stove. As a mother, I wanted to explode. My 15-year-old child, still technically a minor, had suffered a serious workplace injury, and instead of being treated with basic human decency, she was forced into hours of further pain. The more I listened, the angrier I became. She said one of the older coworkers even offered to cover for her, but the manager refused, snapping that if she left the kitchen, she'd be written up and possibly fired. So she stayed, baiting back sobs, cooking for customers who had no idea that a bleeding, blistered teenager was preparing their meals. By the time she finished recounting the story, I was shaking with rage. I wanted to storm into that restaurant and drag the manager out by the collar. But my daughter looked so broken that night, and instead of escalating immediately, I comforted her first, tending to her burn and promising that this wasn't over. What that manager had done wasn't just cruel, it was illegal. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to be smart. Revenge is best served not in an outburst but in a carefully planned strike, one that ensures the guilty face the maximum consequences. And so I decided right then and there, if they thought they could treat my daughter like this, they were about to learn the hard way just how wrong they were. The very next morning, I started making calls. First, I reached out to HR, but unsurprisingly, they brushed me off with empty words. "We take all complaints seriously," they said, but I could tell they were already trying to sweep this under the rug. They asked if I had any witnesses, any proof. Luckily, my daughter had friends among the staff who were more than willing to back her up. They confirmed that she had burned herself, that she was crying, and that the manager refused to let her leave. Then I took it further. I called the local labor board and reported the incident, making sure to emphasize that she was underage and being forced to work in unsafe conditions. I also contacted a lawyer who specialized in workplace injuries. The more I explained, the more people told me that what happened was not just immoral but a blatant violation of labor laws. That gave me strength, but I wasn't satisfied with just legal channels. I wanted the manager to feel what my daughter had felt, powerless, cornered, and exposed. So I gathered every scrap of evidence I could find. Photos of the burn, text messages from her coworkers, even the hospital report when I took her in for treatment later that week. Then I turned to the one weapon businesses fear the most, public exposure. I went online and shared her story, detailing every cruel detail, naming the restaurant, and tagging local news stations. Within hours, it started gaining traction. Other former employees chimed in with their own horror stories about the same manager, describing toxic work culture, harassment, and unsafe practices. The post exploded overnight, shared hundreds of times, and soon the restaurant's social media pages were flooded with angry comments from the community. Meanwhile, the manager tried to intimidate us. He called, insisting that my daughter was exaggerating and threatening legal action for defamation. But I wasn't scared. I had the truth on my side, and I knew once the public saw it, he'd have no ground to stand on. Sure enough, within days, reporters showed up at the restaurant asking questions. Parents in the community were outraged that a minor had been treated this way. Customers started boycotting. The so-called family-friendly establishment suddenly looked like the most unfriendly place in town, and business plummeted. Still, I wasn't finished. I wanted to make sure my daughter saw that people who abuse their power don't just get away with it. I knew the real revenge would come when this manager faced accountability not just from the public but from the law itself. And I was determined to see it through until the very end. What happened next was almost poetic. The labor board launched an investigation, and when they interviewed my daughter and her co-workers, the truth poured out. Multiple staff members admitted that the manager often berated them, forced them to work long hours without breaks, and ignored safety protocols. The burn incident was just the most shocking example of his negligence. It turned out he had a history of pushing teenagers to the brink, knowing they were too scared to speak up. As the investigation unfolded, the restaurant owners panicked. They tried to paint it as a misunderstanding, but the evidence was undeniable. Not only had my daughter been mistreated, but there were countless labor violations stacking up against them. They faced heavy fines, possible lawsuits, and a PR disaster they couldn't spin away. Eventually, the owners made a decision. They fired the manager in an attempt to save face. But by then, the damage was already done. His reputation was in tatters, and no respectable business in the area wanted to touch him. For my daughter, it was empowering. She went from feeling humiliated and powerless to watching the person who had belittled her lose everything. She saw firsthand that standing up for yourself, even when it's terrifying, can lead to justice. And for me, as her parent, there was no greater satisfaction than seeing the man who made her suffer squirm under the weight of his own cruelty. But karma wasn't finished with him yet. Word spread quickly, and soon I heard through the grapevine that his own family turned on him when they saw the news coverage. His wife was embarrassed, his kids were ashamed, and his relatives stopped defending him. It was like watching his whole world collapse piece by piece. And though I don't usually take pleasure in someone else's downfall, this time I made an exception. He had forced a child to endure hours of agony, and now he was learning what agony felt like in his own way. In the months that followed, life slowly returned to normal. My daughter healed physically, though the scar on her arm is a reminder of what happened. But emotionally, she grew stronger. She realized her voice mattered, that she didn't have to accept mistreatment just because someone older and in power told her to. She decided to quit the restaurant and focus on school, and later she found a new job with an employer who actually respected her. As for me, I carried a sense of closure. We had taken on a corrupt manager and won. But more than that, we turned our pain into a story that inspired others. Parents reached out, thanking us for speaking up, saying they would now watch out for how their teens were treated at work. Other young workers shared their stories, some of them heartbreaking, but all of them grateful that someone had broken the silence. The manager, from what I heard, never recovered his career. Last I knew, he was working odd jobs, a far cry from the authority he once abused. It may sound harsh, but to me, it was fitting justice. He had gambled on the assumption that no one would challenge him, and he lost everything because of it. When I think back on that night when my daughter came home in tears, I remember the helplessness I felt. But looking at her now, standing tall, more confident, and unafraid to speak her truth, I realized that out of that pain came growth. We didn't just take revenge on someone who hurt us, we made sure he could never hurt another kid again. And that, more than anything, was the sweetest victory.